I mailed my soldier husband a onesie saying he'd be a dad. Then a bomber stole him. Now, his army brothers surprised me, and I'm unraveling what it means. I'll never forget the day I sent that little onesie to Chris. It was a Tuesday, gray and dreary outside our little house in Georgia. But inside, I was buzzing with a secret I couldn't wait to share. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I stitched the words onto the soft white fabric. Chris, you're going to be a dad. Each letter was sloppy but full of love, my clumsy fingers trying to match the wild thumping in my chest. I'm Emily Harris, and back then, I still believed the world could be kind. Chris was halfway across the globe, a U.S. Army specialist stationed in Afghanistan, and I could already picture his face when he opened my package. Those hazel eyes lighting up, that goofy grin spreading ear to ear. He'd call me, I knew it. His voice all crackly through the static, teasing me about how he'd teach our kid to throw a football better than I ever could. I wrapped the onesie in tissue paper, taped up the box, and drove to the post office with the radio off, just me and my thoughts. The clerk smiled as she weighed it, asking if it was something special. The most special, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't tell her it was my way of pulling Chris close, of tying us together despite the miles and the war. When I got home, I sat on the couch, clutching a mug of tea that went cold while I stared at the phone, waiting. 3 days later, it rang. "Em, you're kidding me!" he shouted, laughing so loud I could hear his buddies cheering in the background. "A dad? Me? I'm gonna be the best, I swear!" I laughed too, tears spilling down my cheeks, imagining him holding that onesie like it was a treasure map to our future. That joy lasted exactly 1 week. 7 days of dreaming about cribs and baby names, of texting Chris terrible dad jokes he'd grown at. Then the knock came. I was washing dishes, humming some stupid song, when I saw the uniforms through the window. 2 soldiers, stiff and somber, their hats in their hands. My stomach dropped before they even spoke. "Mrs. Harris," one started, his voice too soft, too careful. I don't remember much after that, just bits of words like convoy and bomber and sorry. A suicide bomber had hit Chris's unit. He was gone. My Chris, with his dumb jokes and big dreams, was gone, and I was left standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt too big, too quiet. I sank to the floor, the dish soap still slick on my hands, and screamed until my throat burned. The soldier stayed, awkward and helpless, until a neighbor came over. She held me while I sobbed, but nothing could fill the hole Chris left. I was 26, a widow and pregnant with a baby he'd never meet. That night I crawled into bed, pulling his old hoodie over my pillow. It still smelled like him, sweat and cedar, and I pressed my face into it, begging the universe to let me wake up from this nightmare. But morning came, cold and real, and I had to face it. My world was shattered. The days after blurred together. People brought casseroles, said nice things about Chris, but their voices sounded like they were underwater. I'd sit on the couch, one hand on my belly, feeling the tiny kicks that were all I had left of him. Our baby girl, she was my anchor, the only thing keeping me from drifting away. I'd talk to her sometimes, whispering into the dark. "Your daddy loved you so much," I'd say, my voice cracking. "He'd have spoiled you rotten." It hurt to think of all he'd miss, her first steps, her giggles, the way she'd wrap him around her little finger. But it hurt more to think she'd never know him. I kept that onesie, though. It came back with his things, folded neat in a box that smelled like dust and metal. I couldn't open it for weeks, but when I did, there it was, wrinkled but still saying what I'd wanted him to know. I held it to my chest, sobbing again, but this time something else stirred in me. Anger, maybe, or stubbornness. Chris was gone, but our girl wasn't. She was coming, and I had to keep him alive for her somehow. I didn't know how yet, but I'd figure it out. One stitch, one breath, one day at a time. After Chris was gone, I couldn't let him fade away completely. Not for me, and not for our baby girl. I'd sit in our quiet Georgia house, the walls closing in, and think about how he'd called his army buddies his brothers. They'd been with him through sandstorms and firefights, and he'd trusted them with his life. Now, I needed them too. I'm Emily Harris, and I was drowning in grief, but I had to do something to keep Chris close. So, one humid afternoon, I dug through the closet for a box of pink and blue confetti I'd bought months ago, back when we'd laughed about doing a gender reveal together. My hands shook as I poured it into an envelope, scribbling a note. For Chris's brothers, find out with me. I mailed it to Afghanistan, hoping they'd care enough to open it. Days dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I'd stare at the phone, willing it to ring, my belly growing rounder while the emptiness inside me stayed sharp. Then, one evening, it buzzed. A video call from a number I didn't know. I answered, and there they were. Jake, Mike, Sam, and a few others, their faces dusty and tired under flickering lights. "Hey, Em," Jake said, holding up the envelope. "You ready?" I nodded, biting my lips so hard I tasted blood. They tore it open, and pink confetti exploded everywhere, sticking to their uniforms, floating in the air like tiny promises. "A girl!" Mike yelled, punching the air, and Sam whooped so loud it echoed. They grinned like it was their own kid, and I laughed, a real laugh, shaky and wet with tears, feeling a flicker of light in the dark. I named her Lily Michelle Harris, after her daddy, my Chris. She came in March, screaming and perfect, her tiny fists waving like she was already fighting the world. I held her in the hospital, alone except for the nurse's soft footsteps, and whispered, "We've got this, you and me." But I wasn't sure I believed it. Then the front door creaked open one day, and there they were, Chris's brothers, back from their tour. They'd timed it just right, like fate had nudged them home to meet her. Jake stepped in first, his boots still caked with desert sand, and his tough guy face softened when he saw Lily in my arms. "She's got his eyes," he said, voice rough, and I nodded, too choked up to speak. They piled into the living room, these big, loud soldiers shrinking the space with their gear and their stories. Mike plopped onto the couch, peering at Lily like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. "Harris would have been a mess over her," he said, smirking, "probably crying more than you did, Em." I smiled, picturing Chris fumbling with diapers, and for a second the ache wasn't so sharp. Sam knelt beside me, his hands hovering like he was afraid to break her. "Can I?" he asked, and I passed Lily over, watching her settle into his arms. She cooed, and his grin split wide open. "Hey, little lady," he murmured. "Your dad was my best pal." We talked for hours, about Chris, about the dumb bets he'd make, like racing lizards in the sand, or how he'd brag about me to anyone who'd listen. They painted him so clear I could almost hear his laugh bouncing off the walls, but under it all, a tension hummed. These guys weren't just visiting, they were keeping a promise. I saw it in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other, like they'd decided something without me knowing. I clutched Lily's blanket tighter, wondering if I could lean on them without falling apart. They weren't Chris, but they were his family. And maybe, just maybe, they could be ours too. That night, after they left, I sat in the rocking chair with Lily asleep against my chest. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel as empty. I traced her tiny fingers, thinking about that pink confetti raining down on those soldiers half a world away. They'd cheered for her, for us, and it hit me. Chris had left me more than memories. He'd left me his brothers, rough around the edges but steady as stone. I kissed Lily's forehead, whispering, "You've got a big family, sweet girl." And for the first time since he'd gone, I felt a thread of hope stitching itself into the mess of my heart. The day Chris's brothers came back from their tour, my nerves were buzzing like a hive of bees. I'd asked them to join me for a photo shoot with Lily, something to hold on to Chris's memory, and they'd said yes without hesitation. I'm Emily Harris, and I was still figuring out how to breathe without him, but this felt like a step, small, shaky, but forward. It was a crisp March afternoon when we met at a quiet park just outside town, the kind with old oaks and a breeze that carried the smell of damp earth. I stood there, Lily in my arms, her little body warm against me, watching Jake, Mike, and Sam tromp over in their uniforms. Their faces were serious, eyes soft but steady, like they knew this was more than just pictures. I'd brought a onesie I'd sewn for Lily, just like the one I'd sent Chris, only this one said, "My daddy, my hero," in red thread across the front. She squirmed as I slipped it on her, her tiny legs kicking, and I smoothed her dark hair so much like his. "You're gonna make him proud today," I whispered, my voice catching. The guys gathered around, their boots crunching on the grass, and I handed Lily to Sam. He cradled her like she was made of glass, his big hands awkward but gentle. "Okay, Em," Jake said, rubbing the back of his neck. "What's the plan?" I took a deep breath, the air tight in my chest. "I want you to circle up," I said. "Hold her together, like he would've." They nodded, no questions, and shuffled into place. Jake stood tall, Mike crouched a little, and Sam stayed in the middle, Lily nestled in his arms. Then, like they'd rehearsed it, they stretched out their hands, big, calloused palms facing up, forming a ring around her. I stepped back, my camera trembling as I focused. Lily blinked up at them, her hazel eyes wide and curious, and they looked down at her, their faces softening in a way I hadn't seen before. Click. The shutter snapped, and I swear the sound echoed louder than it should have. I checked the screen and my throat locked up. There she was, my baby girl, tiny and perfect, framed by those rough hands like they were shielding her from the world. The sunlight hit just right, catching the red letters on her onesie, and for a split second it felt like Chris was there, his warmth sneaking into the frame. I wiped my eyes quick, hoping they wouldn't notice, but Mike caught me. "You okay, Em?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's him, you know? Through her. Through you guys." He clapped a hand on my shoulder, heavy and solid, and didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Jake crouched beside me as I packed up the camera, his eyes on Lily. "He'd have loved this," he said, almost to himself. "Harris was crazy about family." I swallowed hard, nodding. "He was. I hope I can give her that." My voice cracked, and Jake looked at me, really looked, like he could see the cracks I was trying to hide. "You're not alone, Em," he said, firm but quiet. "We've got your back." I wanted to believe him, God, I did, but the ache in my chest wouldn't let go. The air felt thick, heavy with all the words I couldn't say, and I wondered if they could feel it too. As we walked back to the car, Lily dozed off in my arms, her little breaths puffing against my neck. The guys trailed behind, their voices low, and I glanced at that photo again on my camera screen. It was stunning, heartbreaking, and I knew I'd frame it, hang it where I'd see it every day. But it didn't erase the question gnawing at me. Could I keep Chris alive for her? Or would I always feel this alone, even with his brothers standing right there? Days turned into weeks, and I was barely holding it together. I'm Emily Harris, and every little thing Lily did, every coo, every sleepy smile, punched me in the gut with how much it reminded me of Chris. His laugh used to fill our Georgia house, loud and goofy, and now it was just me and her, rattling around in the silence. I'd sit on the couch, staring at that photo from the park. Lily cradled in the hands of Chris's brothers, her "My Daddy, My Hero" onesie glowing in the light, and feel the ache twist deeper. She was growing fast, hitting milestones he'd never see, and I was terrified I'd fail her without him. The weight of it pressed on me like a storm cloud that wouldn't budge. His brothers, Jake, Mike, and Sam, didn't let me sink too far, though. They'd show up unannounced, filling the house with noise and warmth I didn't know I needed. Jake would haul in bags of groceries, grumbling about how I wasn't eating enough, while Mike sprawled on the floor with Lily, making faces until she giggled. Sam was quieter, sitting with me on the porch some nights, just listening to the crickets while I tried not to cry. They'd tell stories about Chris, how he'd bet a week's pay he could outrun a Jeep, or how he'd talk about me like I hung the moon. "He was a sap for you, Em," Mike said once, smirking. "Said you made the best mac and cheese in the state." I'd laugh, but it always faded into a sting, knowing I'd never cook for him again. One evening, the air thick with spring humidity, Jake knocked on the door. I was folding Lily's clothes, tiny socks and onesies scattered across the table, when he stepped in, his face tight, like he was holding something heavy. "Hey, Em," he said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Found this in Chris's stuff when we cleared his bunk." My hands froze mid-fold, the sock slipping to the floor. He handed it to me, and I saw Chris's messy scrawl on the envelope. "For Em and the kid." My heart thudded so hard I thought it'd burst. "Go on," Jake said, his voice soft. "He'd want you to read it." I sank into a chair, my fingers shaking as I tore it open. Lily was napping in her crib, the house dead quiet except for the creak of the wood under me. The letter was short, scratched out in his rushed way, but every word hit like a punch. "Em, if you're reading this, I screwed up and didn't make it back. I'm sorry. I love you. Always will. You're strong, tougher than me, and our kid's gonna be a firecracker with you as her mom. Tell her I'm her biggest fan. I'll watch over you both, promise." Tears blurred the ink, dripping onto the page, and I pressed a hand to my mouth to keep from sobbing loud enough to wake Lily. He'd written it before he died, before he even knew about her, like he'd sensed the end coming. I looked up at Jake, his eyes steady on me, and something cracked open inside. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew I'd need this." Jake nodded, sitting across from me. "He was always planning for you, Em, even when he was being a clown." I clutched the letter, the paper crinkling, and felt a shift, like a knot loosening just enough to let me breathe. Chris was gone, but he'd left me this, a piece of him to hold on to. And his brothers, they weren't just sticking around out of duty, they were here, real and solid, picking up where he left off. That night after Jake left, I sat with the letter on my lap, Lily's soft snores drifting from her room. The house still felt too big, too empty, but it wasn't as cold. I traced his words with my finger. "You're strong, Em," and thought about the guys, how they'd become my lifeline without me even asking. They weren't Chris, couldn't fill that hole, but they were family now, stitched into our lives with every visit, every story. I folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer by my bed, my hands steadier than they'd been in months. Maybe I wasn't alone after all, not with his words, not with his brothers, not with Lily sleeping just down the hall. Months had slipped by, and I was starting to find a rhythm, even if it was shaky. I'm Emily Harris, and life with Lily was a mix of soft moments, like her grabbing my finger with that gummy smile, and hard ones where the quiet of our Georgia house reminded me Chris wasn't coming home. I'd gotten used to the ache, though, wearing it like an old sweater. Familiar, heavy, but mine. One Saturday, I was folding her clothes, the washer rumbling in the background when the doorbell chimed. Lily was napping, her little chest rising and falling in her crib, so I tiptoed over, expecting maybe Jake with another bag of groceries. Instead, it was Sam, grinning like he'd just pulled off some big prank. "Hey, Em," he said, rocking on his heels. "Get dressed. Something nice." We've got a surprise." His eyes sparkled and I frowned, confused. "What's going on?" I asked, brushing flour off my shirt from the muffins I'd been baking. "Just trust me," he said, winking. "Bring Lily too." My stomach twisted with a nervous flutter, but I nodded. I slipped on a sundress, scooped Lily up, her sleepy murmurs making me smile, and followed Sam out the door, the spring air warm and sweet with honeysuckle. He drove us to the park, the same one where we'd taken that photo months ago. I spotted Jake and Mike under the big oak, but they weren't alone. Dozens of soldiers stood there, some in uniform, some not, their faces a mix of familiar and new. My heart stuttered as we got closer, Lily wiggling in my arms. "Sam, what is this?" I whispered, but he just steered me forward. The crowd parted, and there, bolted into the ground, was a shiny bronze plaque. I read it, my breath catching. "In honor of Specialist Chris Harris, hero and father." His name gleamed in the sunlight, and I pressed a hand to my mouth, tears prickling fast. Jake stepped up, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone. "Harris was one of us, best damn guy I knew. This is for him, for you, Em, and for Lily." The soldiers snapped to attention, saluting as one, their hands sharp against their brows. Lily giggled, clapping her chubby hands like she understood, and a laugh bubbled out of me, wet and surprised. I looked around, faces Chris had fought beside, laughed with, and felt him there somehow in the rustle of the leaves, in the strength of their stares. Sam leaned in close, his voice dropping low. "We're not done," he said, a grin tugging at his lips. "We've been talking, all of us. We're starting a fund, for Lily. College, whatever she needs down the road. Harris would have wanted her set." I froze, the words sinking in slow like water into dry dirt. "You... what?" I stammered, my eyes darting from him to Jake to Mike, who nodded like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Your family, Em," Mike said, shrugging. "We take care of our own." Tears spilled over then, hot and fast, and I didn't bother wiping them away. Lily squirmed, reaching for Sam, and he took her, bouncing her gently while I stood there, stunned. The crowd murmured, some clapping, others just watching with quiet smiles, and I felt this swell in my chest, grief and gratitude crashing together. Chris was gone. His boots would never thud through our door again. But his love? It was right here. Bigger than I'd ever dreamed, carved into that plaque, woven into these men who'd made him their brother. I clutched Lily's blanket, the one I'd wrapped her in that first night home, and looked at the plaque again. "Hero and father," it said, and I whispered, "You are, Chris. You still are." The soldiers started drifting over, shaking my hand, telling me quick stories, how Chris had shared my letters with them, how he'd bragged about our baby before he even knew her. Each word built something inside me, a bridge from him to us, held up by this family I hadn't expected to find. Lily laughed in Sam's arms, the sound cutting through the haze, and I smiled, really smiled, knowing we weren't alone, not now, not ever. Thank you for watching. If you like the story, feel free to comment, like, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.